Nubia and Egypt go back years. Natakamani and Amanatore, shown here, are depicted as typical Egyptians. Nothing about their aesthetic, their life, and the way they look would give it away had it not been known to people that they were not specifically native to the mainlands of Egypt proper. Their temple shows them both smiting their enemies, something that would be weird in ancient Egypt, as most of the time women were not depicted as warriors of any kind. This speaks to a more general African trait of women warriors. But we see several warriors depicted who are men, especially those of princes, who are also shown smiting the enemy, something that isn't really typical in Egypt either. Usually it goes straight to the king, the pharaoh himself. What we do find that is very strange here is that this is continuing up until the 5th century. So, in other words, the Nubians, which would be considered less Egyptian today by most people, seem to have considered themselves very Egyptian. In fact, their state religion was the cult of Isis. This is very strange considering the fact that they should have their own thing. And of course, they had some gods that were unique to them, like Apidemek, as we see some temples showing these lions, and Apidemek, the lion headed god. But again, this is a throwback to an older culture. Even when I look up Sudanese people who lived during the Islamic Golden Age from the 8th century onwards, they seem to always arc back. And I think this is because it has to do with their history, like Zulmun, for example, or Al Jahiz. These people must represent something that must still have stuck with the people, probably even hundreds of years after that. If we go back and we look at the kings of Meroe and Nubia in general, we will see that on and on and on, they continue to style themselves like Egyptians, with no one making them do it. They could have completely dumped all of that and said, well, that was a foreign culture and we don't care. But they continued with it till the 5th century when they were pretty much forced to change their religion. We could brush this off as, oh, it's just Nubians who ran into a superior culture and wanted to keep the cult going. Or we could review it and think of it of how long have the Nubians been under the control of Egyptians? Since its founding, really. At least that's what the evidence shows. So maybe it's harder to break the ties between Egypt and Nubia because Egypt and Nubia were not exactly something separate. So let's look at the last king of the Nubians before they converted to Christianity. Turin Papyrus shows two things that are interesting. It's from 1120 BC. Well, not that specific, but yeah, it's from that era. And it shows at first some erotic scenes, but the other parts of it show a map to Nubia and the mines that are found there. So we do know that they were very interested and well documented into Nubia. Now, let's get into the kings. The final identified Nubian king was Amenepelade. Now, here's the thing about Amenepelade. It's not a guy, it's a woman, continuing this theme of females ruling in Nubia. She was a queen regent, which meant she was holding place for somebody, perhaps a son. She ruled in the later part of the 4th century. Before that, in the first half of the 4th century, was Patrapiamani, another female. Then Apianin, who is an unidentified pharaoh. Then before that was another unidentified pharaoh, both gender and name. Then Yase Bokiamani was a male. Arias Boke, male. Talakadimani, male. Tamen, Tamelerdiamani, male. Tekororidiomani, male. 3rd century. We're still in the 3rd century, by the way. Masha Dakal, 3rd century. Takidiamani, 3rd century. Ameneke Dolo, 3rd century. Amenetarikida, 2nd century. Aritinies Boke, 2nd century. Amenikalika. Now we're back to the females. All those I didn't read was because they were all males, which is going to be more typical than females. What can we say about this female from the 2nd century? Well, nothing much. But what I can say about these Nubian kings going all the way back to Egypt is that, well, I just gave it away. They go back all the way to Taharka and all of those people before Taharka, all the way back till the invasion of Egypt. It starts that far back. Now, from there, this line goes all the way to the 5th century. What should we do with this information? And why is it that every single one of them is dressed like an Egyptian? They're under the cult of Isis. They're worshiping in Egyptian styles, and they're living as Egyptians way after Egypt proper has fallen. Is it because they still see themselves as Egyptians? You don't have to go far to find out that all over Egypt, Upper Egypt, you will find all kinds of buildings, including this one, which depicts the conversion to Christianity and still some veneration of the Egyptians. And of course, like I said, Zulnoon and all these other guys who, even though they converted to Islam, they didn't want to go away from their roots of Egyptian heritage with thousands, not thousands, tens of writings, probably hundreds, but lots of books have been disappeared, of people talking about the Nubians as part of Egypt, as holding a huge part in Egypt, and that they are part of the ancient core of Egypt. With these kings in this line, tracking them, and of course, they still have their unique culture. Not this many women ruling is odd for Egypt, even though there was a bunch of women rulers in Egypt too. The way they depict themselves is slightly variant than what Egyptians typically depicted themselves. And that might be because of a simple reason, because they took the way that the Egyptians depicted them and ran with it. If we go the other way around, we find Alara, who unified Upper and Lower Nubia, making their kingdom great enough that the next kings would be able to conquer Egypt. Kashta was the first to conquer Upper Egypt, taking over some of their most important points. Pierre then joined in, conquering more places in Egypt. Shebitku then came and conquered even more, moving out of Napta and moving into Memphis as the capital, the new capital of this newfound empire. We do not need to go any further because this is a part of the 25th dynasty and has nothing to do with this video. But the point is that the Nubians did not play, and they have never played before in their life. Now keep this in mind. That's not the average individual. Those are just pharaohs and kings and queens. The average individual also belonged to the cult of Isis, which for some reason was very popular in Nubia. Not only this, the cult of Isis, for some selective reason, had these winged creatures which would be depicted all over Meroe, which, by the way, is strange given the fact that the Egyptians themselves, though some belonged to the cult of Isis, worshipped other princely deities above Isis. This happened, though, at certain times in Egypt where this god would get high praise than this god, but for some reason in Egypt it was Isis, even though we know that Tefnut at one point had that strong of an affiliation with Egypt. Though the religions of Nubia paralleled that of Egypt, they tended to worship different aspects of the same mythology. And as you can see, it is said to have Tefnut is said to have escaped to Nubia in a rage, jealous of her grandchildren's higher worship. Only after receiving the title of honorable from Thoth did she return. Now, this may have to do with justifying a truism, something that's true, that Tefnut was being lauded or put in a higher aspect than other gods in Nubia, and they just added this as part of the myth. That's cool. You can do that. But to find out that they then switched to Isis, which, by the way, Tefnut and Isis, keep in mind, are both females. Do you not find it strange that their main god or the gods that they lord above others tend to be females? Now, Epidemic is a male, so obviously they had that as one of their chief gods. So it doesn't mean that they lorded females over men, but they did have this thing of putting even women as their core deities, which is something that almost never happened in Egypt. In conclusion, the Nubians might have been kicked out by the Asiatics from Egypt, but they kept Egypt inside of them and made sure to pass it all the way down. We probably would have never had such strong translations as early as the 8th century had we never had these people. And without those translations, they wouldn't have inspired later translators who then used these writings to translate during the times, the modern times. Keeping the history of Egypt alive for some reason has been important to various different people all over the world, and these guys are no exception. I wonder what they would think of them today being considered complete foreigners of Egypt who had nothing to do with it. Do you think that they would hold the people who say that with their hair and smite them like they did the enemies of Egypt? Or would they be proud of their own kingdom and say that they are not Egyptians? Anyway, tell me what you think. Like, share, subscribe. I forgot all these other things that you have to say. Uh, link. Is there something else that has to happen? Oh, that's what I was forgetting. The comparison to this is that the 5th century, when this all collapsed, well, not didn't all collapse, but a lot of the symbolism went away, and a lot of the actual care of the religions of the Egyptians went away. The Sao people had already been developed in Chad. A much of the Bantu movement had already moved away. 5th century, some of the Bantu buildings had already been built in places of southern Africa. A lot of Ethiopia was already what it was going to be. I mean, this is the core of African history by this time. So for them to keep it to this moment, it's a shame that they had to collapse because 1,000 years of more, if of them holding just for another 1,000 years, we could had seen fully what it was like for them to hold the religion in person.